It's 1993, and after 6 years of dominating the Saturday morning airwaves, toy shelves, and even movie theaters, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles reached their sophomore slump. While it was still a popular brand, the oversaturation of Leo, Raph, Mikey, and Dawn, and dozens if not hundreds of other weird mutants and whatever this thing was, had exhausted the patience and wallets of fans the world over. Not only that, but those that latched onto the heroes in the half-shell in the late 80s were starting to move on to other things as they reached the worst stage of life, being a teenager. Seeing this downtrend in business, Mirage Studios and Playmates enacted a brilliant solution. Market the hell out of the Turtles even harder and faster than ever, not stopping for any reason.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Damn, that is now the current record holder for quickest usage of the Third Strike gag. Alright, so what did this marketing blitz entail? Well, they launched a multitude of new toy lines, a third movie that'll surely be the best one yet, and finally, a three-pronged attack by the masters of TMNT video games, Konami. The intent here was to try and tap into a slightly older market, since most fans of the franchise were indeed getting older. So, Konami produced a multi-platform project which would launch on three of the most popular consoles of the day: the Super NES, the Genesis/Mega Drive, and the aging NES. The three places that the Turtles had thrived on in their pixelated forms. It was an interesting plan, to be fair, well, the video game part of it, because after two arcade beat-em-ups, home versions of said beat-em-ups, the NES original, and various portable games, it was time to switch things up. Now, since this was 1993, the peak of Street Fighter's popularity, it was time for the Turtles to grab their own glistening, oily slice of the fighting game pizza pie. Street Fighter II had sold millions of copies across the SNES and Genesis, so it did make marketing sense that by mixing the exploding genre with the worldwide appeal of the Turtles would quadruple potential sales.
I really wish you'd stop saying things like that.
So, let's open up the sewer cover and breathe in deep, because we're gonna break down each version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters. Let's start with the Genesis. It was released in September of 1993, and in all regions it was called Tournament Fighters, which isn't exactly subtle on who they were trying to target. That's just one notch above slapping a Street Fighter Edition sticker right onto the box. Speaking of the box, actually, in Japan it was represented by a painted illustration that's a mix of Streets of Rage and, I guess, the movie designs of the Turtles, which is odd, but cool nonetheless. In North America, across all platforms, they all shared a really similar cover design, just swapping out a turtle or a villain depending on the version. Kinda sucks that there are only 3 versions of TF and not 4, cause Michelangelo got left out of the box art. I mean, there are lots of Game Boy games based on the Turtles, and even a surprising amount of fighters, too. Would it have killed them to port the NES version to the gray and green hues of the Game Boy? Seems like a waste, Konami marketing. There's 4 main heroes, and you could have had 4 versions. Am I talking about this too long?
Dude, I could beat gaming.
The plot is pretty much nonsense. There's turtle doppelgangers running around, and Splinter gets rat-napped, and Krang's behind it all. I mean, Karai's behind it all. The Turtles have to beat up everyone in their way, of course, but in a nice twist, it's more of an intergalactic affair, where they have to travel to different planets to fight off the doppelgangers. They are joined by Ray Fillet, Sisyphus, and of course, a news anchor and crazy guy in hockey mask. Where's Shredder, you ask? Well, there is no Shredder at all. There's no Shredder in a TMNT video game. Yeah, that's a choice that someone actually made. And it's not like he's a secret boss or anything. There is no Shredder in this game's code. Now, there are some bosses, 3 of them in fact. There's Krang, a random Triceraton, and Karai. How do you unlock them? You don't. There's no code, nothing. Now, if you do some work, you can access them through hacking, but it's a strange omission nonetheless. The cast is already pretty light, and I get making one final boss unplayable, but all three of them? And the Triceratops is right on the fucking box! The game uses a bizarre 3-button only setup. Punch, kick, and taunt. Taunt! Yeah, if you want different types of attacks, you push the D-pad in random directions for command normals, I guess. What's even more bizarre is that even if you did have a Genesis 6 button, the control layout doesn't change. It's still 3 buttons and you can't remap them. So right off of Casey's bat, this game isn't as tight or as responsive when compared to a lot of other options on the Genesis. In terms of visuals, well, it has that slightly grainy look typified by a good percentage of the console's library, and the character sprites are a bit on the small side. Overall, when you compare this to other Konami offerings like Rocket Knight, Hardcore, and Bloodlines, TF just doesn't quite hit that same high watermark. This might be more of a personal preference, but there's something about this game's visuals that never quite did it for me. The music is pretty alright, nothing egregious, but also not all that memorable either. It is, however, the sound effects that tend to grate on the nerves. I know a lot of Genesis games sound like this, but it's all just so rough and farty, especially when you compare it to those other Konami gems I mentioned earlier. The voices are also a garbled mess that sounds so bad they shouldn't have even bothered to include them. Now, as for the actual game, the moment-to-moment gameplay, well, it's fine. With the 3-button setup, I mean, it's not ideal, as most of your attacks feel more random than anything else, which means it just doesn't feel as fluid or as polished as the games it aspires to be. There are some redeeming qualities though. Casey and April are obviously really nice to have. There's some neat stage transitions, the game's super moves, desperation attacks are also pretty fun to watch, and there's even an instant replay feature, which may be the first of its kind. This game did predate Virtua Fighter by a good few months. But other than that, there's not much to say about TF on the Genesis. It's certainly not a terrible fighting game, but it does feel like it could have used more polish and care. If they had let you play as the bosses and instituted an optional control scheme to use more buttons, it would have gone a long way to making it feel like a more robust package. So logically, next we have the SNES version, which, for reasons I wasn't able to uncover, was actually dubbed TMNT Mutant Warriors in Japan. Why? This is the only version of the game that has a different moniker. Who on the marketing team decided to do this? I mean, it would have made sense if all Japanese versions were labeled such, but why just the Super Famicom version? Like, when I think about it, Mutant Warriors is actually less descriptive about what this game actually is, and even way more generic, so I don't know, what's the deal?
Any special order you want those questions answered in?
I do have to give it up for the awesome box art. It looks like a long-lost anime from the 90s, but based on the Turtles. And no, not that really weird Sentai one. God, I would give up pizza for a year if that could somehow will an edgy 90s Turtles OVA into existence. Directed by Masami Obari. Fortunately, you see this same type of artwork in the instruction booklet as well, and they're just all so awesome. In terms of visuals, the SNES version is a sight to behold with its impressive pixel art that brings both the characters and the backgrounds to life. The entire game is just teeming with detail and animation, giving everything a vibrant, appealing 90s look. The sound is also Konami as fuck. In fact, for my money, TF on the Super Nintendo is one of the most underrated OSTs in the 16-bit era. considering how good it is, it doesn't tend to get brought up all that often. Now, as to the game's modes and such, it's pretty much comparable with the Genesis. There's a fairly extensive story mode where you select one of the turtles and follow breadcrumbs to save April and Splinter, complete with cutscenes and text before each bout. There's also a more pared-back arcade mode that has Channel 6 sponsoring the Tournament Fighter Contest, which will shower cash and prizes to the winner. Yeah, the stakes are considerably less than the intergalactic war that the Turtles started in the Genesis port. When the Turtles notice that Shredder's name is on the entry list, that motivates them enough to enter the tournament to kill him again? There's this vague plot that infers Shredder was previously defeated, /missing, /dead, which is why he is dubbed Cyber Shredder in this game. Despite putting these story threads forward, it tends not to follow up on a lot of them. In addition to the 4 turtles, there's Chrome Dome, Wingnut, Armagon, War, Shredder, and finally Asuka, a character made just for this game. There's evidence she might have started as April at some point. She does share some similarities with Miss O'Neill's design in the Genesis game, but it's never really been confirmed. The gameplay itself is pretty damn solid. Fluid animations, impactful attacks, a light combo system, and a good selection of special moves. It also incorporates a more traditional button setup, 2 strengths for punch and 2 for kick. Unlike the desperation moves in the Genesis game, which you can only use when you're almost dead, the SNES version's ultimate attack moves are done by filling up a meter. Once stocked, you have a few seconds to trigger the attack, lest the bar starts to decrease. Maybe due to the power of the SNES, Konami went nuts with these things. I mean, some of this stuff is reaching Capcom vs. game levels. They're also really easy to perform, just press both fierce attacks together. What's even cooler is that this might be the first time a traditional super meter was introduced in a fighting game, as it beat the arcade version of Super Turbo by a few months. If you know of any other earlier example of this in a fighter, let me know in the comments below. And remember, it has to be before September 1993. Even though this version provides a faster, more combo-orientated style of gameplay, it still doesn't quite match up to either SNK or Capcom's best. The damage and associated chip damage of super attacks and most special moves are crazy stupid high. Some supers can even cause more damage when blocked versus when they connect, and sometimes, depending on the situation, some supers can be a touch of death. While at first glance everything seems kosher with the gameplay, the game definitely has some balancing and damage issues when you get into the nitty-gritty. If that wasn't bad enough, the 2 unlockable bosses, a thick-ass beefy Rat King and a godlike version of Karai, throw that balance on its head even harder. If you think like that Omega Rugal or Shadow Jago are crazy, go a few rounds with Karai on a decent difficulty setting. You're gonna regret it. Unlike the other 2 versions of Tournament Fighters though, the SNES one features a few regional differences, some expected and some not. In the Japanese version, Asuka has some added animation frames here and there, and a few less colored pixels here and there. The unexpected change, however, is the Channel 6 Tournament Fighter stage, which for some reason has a hidden breakable wall that you can bust into. Oh shit, Fred, look, it's mutants! And they're fighting! Now, the Japanese version did come out 2 months after the Western one, so I guess this was a cut feature they planned to introduce. In fact, when you consider the 2 stage transitions in the Genesis game, this was probably originally going to be an important aspect to the stages. Now, I think the most famous, earliest examples of backgrounds doing stuff like this was X-Men Children of the Atom, or MK3, but could TF also be the first fighter that had stage transitions like this? Again, let me know if you're aware of any other games that did it first. Finally, to wrap up, the Turtles and the announcer had higher pitched voice samples for whatever reason.
Round one. Fight! Round one. Fight!
Personally, I prefer the Western version when it comes to this. Now, on to the last officially released Tournament Fighters game. The NES had very few one-on-one fighters in its library, and when I say very few, I mean basically none, aside from like Urban Champion or Mode B Double Dragon. Released in 1994, this marked the very last game Konami would publish for the 8-bit powerhouse in North America and Europe, and it's not a bad one to go out on. Strangely though, this version of TMNT TF did not receive a Japanese release. Okay, well, looking at it now, it has to be said this might be one of the best looking NES games ever made, featuring detailed and fairly big sprites, considering the hardware. While there's not a ton of backgrounds, the ones that are here look really nice. I mean, sure, they're basic, but the hardware though! I also find it insane that the floors seem to have some form of line scrolling. Could the NES even do that? Or was this some type of visual trick that was somehow approximating it? In terms of art style and the sprites themselves, it falls right in line with the 8-bit Turtles action games of the day, most notably Manhattan Project. Obviously, it has the smallest roster by far, consisting of the 4 Turtles, Casey Jones, Shredder, and finally Hothead. Alright, Hothead is his own separate rabbit hole. Like a few other characters we've discussed already, he has multiple origins and guises spread across the Archie comics, cartoons, and action figures. He's also known as Chu-Shi, the warrior dragon. The gameplay, since it's shackled by the NES's 2-button pad, feels limited as you'd expect, but there are a few cool special moves at your disposal, and the fighting works well enough. To add some spice, a power-up is randomly offered by a floating Master Splinter Head. If someone grabs this, they can then perform their own desperation, ultimate, whatever you want to call it, attack. Basically, it's just a souped up projectile. I mean, I don't think anyone expected giant dragons and tidal waves and shit. Simplicity carries over to the plot as well. Shredder issues a challenge to the Turtles, and thus they, Casey, and Hothead decide to fight it out to see who's the strongest among them to take on said challenge. Great plan, guys. But instead of that, why don't you all just team up and beat the shit out of Shredder? Like, who cares? The music and sound effects are your typical NES fare, which, when you throw Konami into the mix, is no bad thing. Honestly, while the console does hold it back, it's still really impressive to see this game running today. Yeah, it's basic, there's a lot of sprite flicker, and the roster is only 7 characters deep, with 4 of those being palette swaps, but it's still shocking Konami managed to pull this off. Now, despite this entire series being really solid overall without a real stinker among them, it's pretty unfortunate that the TMNT Media Blitz of 1993 really didn't work out. Ratings for the TV show continued to dip. The third movie was
It's Wet Willy Time, Mo. What'em?
the third movie, and it didn't really help the Turtles' standing with the encroaching popularity of Power Rangers and other competing shows. Even cross-promoting a limited line of Tournament Fighters action figures, which had very little to do with the games, didn't move the profit needle much at all. So, due to all these factors, the TF games were the last Turtle-focused titles Konami would publish until the relaunch of the franchise in 2003. That being said though, while Tournament Fighters was very much another face in a multitude of games trying to ape Street Fighter, the concept of a one-on-one showdown with mutated animals and New Yorkers wearing hockey masks had a concrete appeal. So while underappreciated in its time, in the subsequent decades among the TMNT fanbase, Tournament Fighters was looked upon fairly positively. Therefore, it's not really surprising to know that a community has rallied around these games, with this Super Nintendo version getting the lion's share of the love, but interest in all three has persisted. There's like a competitive scene around these games, spearheaded by the fine folks at the TMNT TF community. There's TMNT TF Championship Edition, which adds colors, art, and a few minor quality of life improvements. And of course, there's TMNT Cross Justice League, an amazing Mugen with some serious talent behind it. It takes the best parts of both Tournament Fighters SNES and Blizzard's Justice League Task Force and mashes both together with tons of new mechanics, stages, and even characters. There's Kirby, the long-lost turtle from the fourth film that was never filmed, and who almost made it into the next mutation before Venus de Milo took his place. Not to be outdone, there's also Omega Shredder, and even April O'Neil, a fun combination of her Genesis appearance and Asuka. I mean, damn, there's even unique endings for each character, lovingly drawn by former SNK artist Nona. This release has proven so popular, they're currently working on a turbo enhancement that features more characters and an in-depth Marvel vs. Capcom style tag mode. The vanilla release, though, is still probably one of the best Mugens I've ever played, and if you have even a passing interest in TMNT, DC Heroes, or fighting games, or all three, I urge you to try it out. Link in the description below. And that about wraps up this little retrospective. As you've probably noticed, Tournament Fighters was a big part of my 90s experience, along with the Turtles in general. Nowadays, it just actually warms my heart to see the franchise supported not only through fan-made efforts, but with new official titles as well, making sure that Turtle Power will truly never die. So that was Tournament Fighters. If you want to see more retrospectives like this, let me know in the comments below or head on over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon sewers and let me know what you'd like to see next. See you next time, and cowabunga, or perestroika? Oh wait, no, I got it.
Frere Jacques. Frere Jacques. Frere
Donnie,
Jacques.
give it up.
Aw.